It shouldn't be hard to explain what I think is the essence of right and wrong, but it is. And the reasons are translucent. I believe that some of the explanations would be conjecture, that a surprising amount of work goes into not only knowing the difference between right and wrong, but in understanding why you think so. To me, I think a clarifying lens can be found in the choice that a professor of mine at Temple University made in a book he wrote about Islamic society. It was Ideals and Realities of Islam. I loved the simplicity of the title, but I also understood the depth and gravity of the difference between ideals and reality in the minds of people who believe different things about right and wrong. I credited in those days the sophistication, sensitivity, and quest for truth that was very clearly motivating this author of academic um, scholarship for helping me overcome the stress and trauma of having an invisible neuroplasm. I don't know now how much of that was cooked into the broth by people planning together from different um, strategic positions in politics because I didn't understand myself as being selected symbolically by a council. I did know that although I've learned more in recent years about the difference between civil law and criminal law, and the issue of social comity, meaning accommodation that can exist, coexistence of similar values in Islamic law and American civil law. As the professor said, the search for the meaning of justice was a very important part of Islamic society. I do know that what he called a malicious enterprise, my question in the eyes of Sharia is um, a good atheist better than a bad Muslim? He said, no, a bad Muslim is better than a good atheist, but that it's a malicious enterprise to undertake that syllogism. I disagree. I think that civil law can be um, compatible with different points of view, and that one's faith doesn't necessarily assume that you will be a better person towards other people. But comedy and issues of social consideration aside, I'm inclined to agree that it's not uh, impossible to reconcile such differences in practice. Tolerance can do a great deal to ameliorate friction from society to society. And this doesn't quite bring me to what I have to say yet. I'm not surprised because ideals and realities are very um, complicated. And it's complicated when your understanding of them is not necessarily accurate because of influences you've had in developing your ideas of ideals and realities. At the University of Pittsburgh, I was derided for idealism as an idealist because of what I believe about right and wrong. And realities were said to be diametrically opposed to ideals. I don't think that when you say ideals and reality, you necessarily mean a diametrical opposition. What you mean is what motivates you, what you aspire to, and what sort of work you have to do to come close to what you're dreaming of, hoping, and aspiring to. So, all of that aside, I'd like to get to the issue of what I consider right and wrong. One of the things I always considered an ideal is the Pittsburgh Public Schools. That's where I went to school as a child, and that's where my rights were bridged. That's where my suffering and tragedy took place. But I always felt that it was in earnest. It was meant to be something to serve the public, to serve the Commonwealth, and to serve the public trust. That the other things were uh, anomalies, that I thought it was random violence because of the criminal neighborhood that I had been put into. I didn't understand as a child that it could be organized, that I could have meant something, symbolized something to those people. It just seemed like social detestation that was personal for whatever reason it existed. I was soft spoken, I was pretty, I was intelligent, I aspired to ideals. Maybe I counted on talent and didn't hate people and reached out to anybody, no matter their um, color or their status. And I believe that ultimately human integrity depends on caring to go about your daily life in a way that does not do other people harm. There was a film which was a cartoon for adults and children called Lapida, or the Floating World. And it had a scene where a huge robot appears on an island in the sky and lays a flower that was trampled at the base of a long soliloquy that stretched on into infinity. And I do believe that something of that should be ingrained in people. I think that when somebody goes out and kills another person, supposedly as a soldier, the question should be on paper. Why did this happen? Was it necessary? Did you try to stop it? Was it resolved favorably? Was it documented? Was the person identified? Was there a reason of any sort for it? And people will argue that you're asking too much, that the nature of conflict doesn't allow such a thing. But I wonder if it's the fact that we don't go about our diplomatic relations that does not allow such a thing. It may be that arguments that are given for the so-called nature of reality and conflict are false consciousness. For example, someone will say those situations in which you have no control. Take the execution of school children at Uvalde. Well, that idea is what puts us at risk in part. And I think that all parents, all civil workers, all diplomats, all politicians should rush to free children from such an idea. And we shouldn't just stand around watching while such an idea takes root and does its deadly harm to people's expectations. So, where does that lead the situation in America? I've seen diplomats from China and Russia recently fault America's presumptions. Of course, I watched the January 6th hearing today, and one of the things that I noted was that Republicans stood up against an ogre who had arisen among them and brought a stop to a potentially cataclysmic overthrow plan. And when you look at Russia, I have nothing to apologize for when it comes to Russian culture. I've always been very open in my admiration for them. I've always been very sarcastic about red baiting and anti communism. I don't believe that the unspoken bad thing idea is true. I think they have a lot to offer. But I also can see that when their leadership is in a position of challenging the body politic as a whole, there's no checks and balances that can be brought to bear on them. So it's not surprising to find that many of Trump's associates worked with the Russians in the Ukraine and reaching out to the Russians favorably because they would like to live in a world where there's no checks and balances too. Now, China, I have nothing to apologize for when it comes to China. I have books about their culture. I lived in Chinatown for 12 years. I was immensely happy, which is surprising considering the circumstances that were my life. And I was immensely happy compared to what I might have been. And I certainly eventually appreciated the survival when new things came along, the survival of my heart when new things came along that I wanted to be prepared to graciously encounter. But what the Chinese gentleman was assessing when it came to the United States seemed to me absolutely true, that we underappreciate the enormous challenge to our democracy posed by an inability to graciously accept the existence and cultures that are different from us, that our ideas of democracy are imperiled more by the way that we go about conducting our democracy than from any outside force meaning ill will. Certainly, China does not mean to undermine or overthrow the United States of America. That is a boogie monster from the id of people who want to project American power and ask no questions and be given no answers when it comes to why unnecessary bloodshed should occur. They don't want our diplomats, our politicians, our teachers, and our students to rush to help the people who are being terrorized by the idea that there's no way out. I don't know why the slidless eye of fear has opened so widely in the United States of America. After all, freedom is supposed to help us live without fear. So, my point being that the human race needs to struggle to identify um, that anyone, no matter how small, can be meaningful and make a difference, and always does. And I think that opposition to the war in the Ukraine is called for on two levels. One, opposition to the terrifying corruption that existed in the Ukraine, where the Orange Revolution resembled January 6th, and the terrible nightmare of the invasion and the suffering and the bloodshed on both sides. It comes down to believing that we can live in a humane world, that power brokers have a lot to do with the problems we face, and the way that we excuse them through sort of a domino effect of frightened allegiance. We saw that in the January 6th hearing, the way that people were willing to violate the law, the right and wrong of our society that's established in good government and checks and balances to accommodate authoritarianism from an office that was being used for belligerent ends. This domino effect travels through our society in a form of fear. Many of us think, well, those are trained professionals from the Republican Party. They were in charge of the Department of Justice. They're not like us. We're just pedestrians. We're civilians. We're citizens. We live here by the grace of God, and if we get scuttled, it's from dumb luck. So our decisions don't make any difference. That's not true. Our decisions are important. And the decision to understand right and wrong is important. And ideals and realities are important. There have been people who've said that Martin Luther King was the greatest American who ever lived. I agree with them. Martin Luther King shed light on the strange tendency of those who write editorials to regard obeying the law as civil disobedience. Ideals and realities are very complicated, but tolerance and understanding and faith towards your fellow man are simple enough that they can help you establish emotional guideposts for how to go about living with one another, in my opinion. And that's the reason why my ideals were always very strongly in favor of the Pittsburgh Public Schools, despite the terrifying crucible that I was put through unrighteously as a child.